Chapter 12. Galbadia Garden. The 3 gardens in the world were all military-style institutions. Greater than normal schools and academies, they specialized in weapons, combat, and strategy training. VIII Garden was, far and above, the best of the 3 in all subjects. Though it was from the smallest, most peaceful country, it was held to a different standard. It was willing to push itself and its students further. Galbadia Garden was the middle child of the 3 gardens. VIII was the first and the standard for what a garden should be. Trabia was the youngest, but the harsh environment it called home bred powerful fighters. Galbadia Garden was trying its hardest to mimic VIII in their operation with one major difference. They had no seed program, but instead fed directly into the Galbadian military. With such a fate over their heads, the best fighters at Galbadia Garden would often transfer to VIII and the seed program. Since they were much more of a true military academy, Galbadia Garden had a completely different sort of feeling. Students were required to wear their uniforms, unlike VIII where it was only a suggestion. They were discouraged from speaking in common areas and every minute of their lives was carefully controlled and regimented. As Squall and the others started walking down the long entrance path towards the garden, Zell and Selfie were pointing up to where they were training with flying machines. One-manned, twin-engine jetpacks the size of a small car. Squall had to admit they would be useful during an attack. However, he would not want to be one of those training on it. No one seemed to care about their approach. Not even the flyer that landed on the long path, his check engine alarm blaring. The seeds were unimportant and Galbadian Garden students weren't encouraged to be curious or questioning. That made for bad subordinates in the military. However, that attitude made for bad superior officers instead. Which was probably a reason that the Galbadian army was so ineffective. Galbadia's colors were red and gold as opposed to VIII's blue and silver. The large spinning disc over their heads had a different design, but it was very similar. Squall was given to understand that the halo was common among all 3 gardens. Though, for the life of him, he could not even imagine what it was, much less what it was for.
Wow,
Selfie breathed as they crept in closer.
Completely different.
As the only one among them who had been to all 3 gardens, she could be considered an expert on the matter. Neither of the other 2 gardens were quite like this.
Sure is quiet,
Zell said uncomfortably as they reached the front gates. Squall looked around and grinned wryly.
I like it.
Beside him, Rinoa started laughing, surprising him.
I said something funny.
Why were people always laughing when he wasn't joking? Rinoa shook her head and refused to tell him what had amused her. He frowned but didn't get a chance to press further as Quistis stepped up to the gates.
Could you leave this one up to me?
She asked, deferring to him.
I've been here several times, and I know the headmaster pretty well. I'll go and explain our situation to him.
Squall nodded and she moved ahead into the garden. Zell ran after her, laughing at the thought of seeing this new garden.
Don't get into trouble,
Squall ordered him as Selfie made to follow. Rinoa, however, remained with him as they walked forward into the garden. He looked over to her but she gave no indication that she wanted to leave him behind. They worked their way into the building, into the quiet, echoing common room. Squall frowned, unsure of where he was supposed to go. Rinoa took over.
Can we find some place to sit down?
She asked, pointing to some benches off to the side. He nodded and led her forward as though he might have been here before. The benches in the center of the garden were all circling around a small ray sunlight let into the common area by a skylight overhead. There were students moving around, but no one really sitting and relaxing. It was a very rigid sort of place, which made it hard for Rinoa to sit and relax. Squall had no problems, leaning back into the bench with a military straight spine, as she perched beside him with her hands in her lap trying not to let her similarly straight spine bother her. Did he have to be so stiff? Was this comfortable for him? He didn't say anything, and the quiet of the common room had her mouth shut as well. She rather didn't like this garden. She really hoped Balam would be as different as Selfie insinuated. She let out a breath and tried to observe Squall out of the corner of her eye. It was the first time she had gotten to see him relax. She rather wondered how he looked doing so. He looked exactly as tense and aware as he had keeping watch around their campfire. One arm was back along the bench, the other was holding onto the hilt of his gun blade. Like he might expect someone to come towards them, guns blazing, at any second.
"Can I see your gun blade?"
Rinoa asked suddenly. His eyes moved towards her, then back towards the common area.
"Why?" "I want to see. Please."
She gave him a sweet, wide-eyed look that had his gut clenching. The way her hands were resting on her lap was pushing up her breasts, and the way her back was set pressed them forward. Her eyes were wide, her pink lips were slightly open. He was weak and too easily manipulated. Squall set his sheath across his lap with the hilt facing her. Rinoa's eyes widened in delight. Her tiny, soft hand reached out and took hold of his hilt. Biting her lip, she slid it slowly out of its sheath and almost into her own lap.
"Oh, wow,"
she laughed gently.
"It's heavier than it looks. And so big. It's just above the standard size of any saber,"
Squall corrected her.
"Well, maybe, but Cypher's was so much thinner." "He let you see Hyperion?" "Well, no, not like this. He showed it off, but he didn't want me to touch it. Said it was sacred ground. I kind of thought it was funny."
She chuckled. Her slender fingers reached out and gently stroked the ridges on the long blade that were carved into the same lion shape as his necklace and matching ring.
"Yours is so much bigger than his. Especially up close,"
she whispered, continuing to caress the blade somehow sensually. He reached out and caught her arm just before she could touch the edge.
"It's sharp. Be careful."
She smiled and nodded. She drew back gently and reached up to instead to run her fingers on the barrel of the revolver half of the blade. Satisfied, Squall leaned back again and continued explaining his weapon.
"Cypher chose to lighten his burden so he could shoot easier. I chose to keep the strength with the trade-off of the weight. I prefer the power though." "Yeah, me too."
Rinoa reached up and touched the base gently. The chain at the end jingled and caught her attention. She picked up the lion pendant and smiled as she caressed the face of it.
"It's not like you really sacrificed anything. You just had to get stronger."
The result of which was that his arms were like steel. She approved wholeheartedly. Initially grunting at the weight, Rinoa lifted it up so she could more easily see the design. Squall watched her handle his weapon with shielded eyes. She looked a lot better with the metal in her hands than he would have believed possible. She was being careful and gentle, almost lovingly caressing the body of his blade.
"It's thick, too,"
she murmured, looking over to him. Her eyes were sparkling.
"Helps keep balance on the gun,"
he returned calmly. What was she doing?
"Does it take long to reload?" "Only if you're inexperienced." I've got the turnaround down to only a few seconds. Woo, so fast.
Rinoa laughed as she set it back down. She didn't stop touching it though. Her hand stroked up and down, enjoying the smoothness of the hard metal.
You know, seeing how well you worked this thing, I still can't believe how heavy it is. It's all a matter of practice. You'll get as good with your own weapon soon enough.
Rinoa started giggling and Squall frowned at her. He really didn't understand what he could have possibly been funny this time.
What? Oh, nothing.
She slid the gun blade back into its sheath.
Squall, answer me a question. What is it? You fought a lot of different kinds of monsters, right? And studied even more, hey? I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I'm fairly proficient. So, have you ever fought the beast with two backs?
She grinned at him sweetly.
Beast with two backs?
Squall frowned.
I haven't even heard of it. What region is it from?
Rinoa was laughing again and Squall frowned at her once more. He just stared, feeling like he was missing part of a joke.
Will the seed party from Balam Garden please report to the second floor waiting room?
A voice over the loudspeaker said softly. In the quiet, it was easily heard.
That's us,
Squall said, getting to his feet.
You can tell me more about the beast with two backs later. Oh, absolutely.
Rinoa was laughing as she stood to follow him. What was she giggling about? What was he missing here? The second floor waiting room was used for official visitors for the headmaster or other such personnel, usually professionally related. Zell was already there when Squall and Rinoa walked inside. It didn't take long for Selfie to skip inside. She immediately went for the wide window along the wall so she could look out. Squall didn't understand why she was so fascinated with things outside of windows. Quistis joined them in her own time. She walked inside, her expression quite calm.
How'd it go?
Squall asked.
They understood our situation,
she nodded. Her eyes moved over to Zell who had taken a seat. His eyes boring holes into the ground, his fists clenched tight in nervousness. She moved over to him and smiled, lowering her eyes to his level.
And Balam Garden is safe?
Zell let out a long sigh as his body sighed in relief. It looked like a large weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Rinoa smiled as Squall nodded. He kept his relief internal, but he couldn't deny that he was happy that there was no bad news. Quistis stood up and spoke to them all again.
The attack on the president in Timber was classified as an independent action. There was an official notice from the Galbadian government saying that Balam Garden is not being held responsible.
Zell nodded, happy that his enormous mess-up hadn't resulted in the ultimate price. Then he frowned as he realized what that meant.
So? Cypher's taking all the blame.
Quistis nodded as her face went impassive. Not quite sad, not quite unaffected. A carefully neutral expression that betrayed nothing.
The trial is over, and the sentence has been carried out.
A tense silence fell over the room as everyone let the implications of that statement sink in. He had attacked the president, had threatened his life. There was really only one sort of sentence that could be laid over such a person. Rinoa knew that better than anyone. Her heart stilled as she realized that Cypher had been killed.
He was executed.
She breathed. For a moment, she couldn't believe it. Then, she did and her body slumped.
Of course he was. He attacked the president. He sacrificed himself for the forest owls.
She moved over towards the couch. She didn't really trust her own legs to be able to hold herself up for much longer. The sadness and guilt was weighing her down now.
It was your group that got Cypher involved in all this.
Quistis crossed her arms. It wasn't a question. It wasn't said in anger. It was a simple statement of facts.
You're a resistance faction, right? You must have been prepared for the worst. I'm sure Cypher was prepared, too. So don't think of it as Cypher sacrificing himself for you.
Quistis flinched as she realized how cold her own words sounded. She needed to stop emulating Squall in situations like these.
I'm sorry. I guess that wasn't much consolation.
Rinoa took a seat, her eyes downcast. Cypher was trying to be a seed. So of course he must have been prepared for the fact that he might one day lose his life on a mission. Knowing him, he probably would have preferred such a glorious death to one where he wasted away of old age or disease. That did little to alleviate her own sadness at knowing he was gone. She heard footsteps approaching and her eyes focused on a pair of black leather boots. She looked up to see Squall looking down at her, his expression closed off. It must have been, she decided, his way of being comforting and there for her.
I really liked him,
she said to him, her voice heavy.
He was always full of confidence, smart. Just by talking to him, I felt like I could take on the world.
She realized now that she would never get to feel that way again. Cypher was gone, and that was a rather large loss. There was no one quite so big as Cypher. He dreamed big, he talked big, he acted big. And somehow everything seemed so much smaller knowing he was gone.
Your boyfriend?
Selphie asked, looking at her from over the back of the sofa.
I don't really know,
Rinoa frowned. She didn't know how to define what she had with Cypher. He had certainly never called her his girlfriend. Yet, she had always felt so close to him.
I think I was in love. I don't know how he felt. Do you still love him?
Selphie tilted her head.
If I did, I wouldn't be able to talk about it like this.
That was an easier question to answer.
But I still considered him a friend. It was last summer. I was only 16. We met on vacation from our schools. He's the entire reason I found my way to Timber. I don't think I could have made it there without him. We had lots of fun. Lots of fond memories.
She blinked and looked up as Squall moved away from her, around the couch. She realized how that must have sounded to him, but she didn't want to take it back. She wouldn't erase her young, teenage, summer love. She would mourn Cypher, and treasure her memories of Cypher. Of the brash young man that had given her courage.
You really hated Cypher, didn't you, Zell?
Selphie asked, looking at the strange expression on his face.
Yeah, but...
He trailed off, his face narrowing further. Like he wasn't sure what to feel.
He was from Garden. He was one of us. I guess. I mean, if I can. I wanna get revenge.
Squall frowned as he looked between the three of them. What was this?
I don't have any good memories of him,
Quistis admitted, sitting next to Rinoa. She looked rather guilty as she crossed her arms over her stomach.
I've seen some troubled children, but he was beyond troubled.
Rinoa made a face and Quistis realized how that sounded and felt guilty. She was almost as bad at comforting as Squall was.
Well, he wasn't really that bad of a guy.
Squall shook his head just slightly. No. This was. Zell shifted uncomfortably.
I didn't like the guy, but executed.
No. No, this was so wrong. I liked him. He wasn't a bad guy. One of us. Cypher. He had become just a memory. Someone to talk about. To remember. Essentially, he was nothing. A horrible, cold feeling settled in Squall's stomach as he had a horrible thought. Would they? Would they talk about him this way when he died, too? Squall was this and that. Using past tense. Saying whatever they wanted. Was this what death was all about? Was this what it meant to pass on? No. Not for him. He wasn't going to have it. Quistis looked up as she realized that Squall hadn't said a word. His head was lowered, his bangs having fallen over his eyes so she couldn't see his expression. Cypher had been his training partner and, despite everything, they were closer to each other than almost anyone. Was he upset? She should say something.
What's wrong, Squall?
She asked gently. Squall exploded.
I won't have it.
He threw out his arm, his teeth bared. More expression on his face than any of them could ever remember him showing. After so long of calm distance, it was disturbing to see it. Everyone jumped, Zell literally to his feet, when he did so.
What?
He asked, startled.
Are you mad?
Selphie asked, surprised.
I won't have anyone talk about me in the past tense.
He snapped. Squall. Rinoa called out after him, but it was too late, he was running out. When she made it to the door and looked out for him, he was already gone.
Will the seed party from VIII Garden please report to the front gates?
The call over the loudspeakers lifted Squall's head from where he had been looking over the rails of the second story down to the first floor central room below. He had been staring deep into the rays of light coming down from the ceiling, trying to calm his own disturbed heart. Squall knew very well that he could die on assignment. He had been close many times in all his years of training. Intellectually, he always knew he could die. Emotionally, he had never really cared. What did it really matter anyway? Yet seeing the aftermath of death, seeing how others reacted, that had affected him. It made him really think. When he died, what would happen? His name would be inscribed on the wall on the first floor that held the name of all the seeds that died in action. It wasn't a long list now, but it would only grow. His things would be appropriated by the garden. He would be a memory. He would be absolutely nothing. That was a harder to realization to deal with than simple death. But the call over the intercom meant that it was time to move. They wouldn't be calling the seed party down unless there was a need to speak to them. Which probably meant that he was about to receive another assignment. And his first one wasn't even over yet. Figuring he wasn't going to accomplish anything standing here, he began making his way down towards the first floor. As he was walking around the wide circle, he saw Selphie running across the common area towards the entrance. He descended the stairs to the first floor. As he was coming out, he saw a group of students being drilled by an instructor who was yelling at them for running in the halls. They all wore the same maroon running suit. Except for Zell, who was at the end for some reason.
Now get down and give me 50 push-ups.
The instructor snapped, irritated. As a unit, the group, including Zell, lowered themselves and obeyed the command.
What are you doing?
Squall asked him.
Got caught running,
Zell said, controlling his breathing through the workout.
Hey, you wanna bet I can outwork these wimps?
No, Squall raised an eyebrow at him. As they spoke, a girl started walking by. She seemed completely oblivious to the boys. They were not oblivious to her. Nor was Zell. Squall frowned as he stopped and craned his neck to look up her skirt as she passed.
What is wrong with you?
Squall asked, glaring slightly.
Uh-oh.
Zell looked over and saw the others already ahead of him.
It.
Squall rolled his eyes as Zell threw himself into the exercise, metaphorical guns blazing.
When you're done with those 50, give me 200,
Squall told him, turning away.
As punishment for sexually harassing that girl. Worth it.
Zell called out, laughing.
If the Galbadian students finish before you, give me 100 more. What?
There was no way he could finish 250 before they finished only 50. Satisfied with the punishment, Squall continued forward towards the front gate. He couldn't imagine Zell would take long, even with that as a prerequisite for joining them. Squall didn't make it far before he heard his name called out by a familiar voice.
Yo!
Squall! He stopped, turned, and looked up to see Rajan of all people standing at the glass rail of the second-story walkway. He was waving at him. Then he turned and ran backwards. Squall stayed in place as he mentally tracked Rajan's movements down the hall, down the stairs, then. Laughing slightly, Rajan, with Fujin right on his tail, came running towards him.
What are you doing here?
Squall asked them.
What am I doing?
Rajan asked, smiling at him.
I'm a messenger, you know? Brought you new orders from Headmaster Sid, you know. What kind of order? I dunno,
he shrugged.
Didn't tell us and we didn't ask. Gave it to the head honcho here. Just did what Headmaster Sid wanted, you know.
Explain, Fujin ordered him shortly. Rajan nodded, complying happily.
We were supposed to go to Timber, but the trains have all stopped going there. So we had no other choice but to come here. Kinda relieved to see you guys here too. Cypher. Oh, yeah. Wasn't Cypher with you? He said he was coming to Timber, too. Did he find you?
Squall hesitated. These two worship Cypher. They probably thought he was Hein himself, come back in human form. How did you tell people who cared that much that the center of their affections had died just like that? Like ripping off a bandage, he decided. There really was no way to break it gently.
Cypher is dead,
he said, controlling his voice. The two of them started, staring.
I heard he was tried in Galbadia, then executed.
He was prepared for tears. For anger. For disbelief. He was not prepared for derision and laughter.
Lies.
Rajan was holding his gut, he was laughing so hard.
That's gotta be a lie, you know. There's no way he'd put up with a trial, you know? Or an execution for that matter. It's just so not Cypher, you know.
Actually, he did know. Just trying to picture Cypher sitting still for his own trail was funny. He definitely wouldn't have been easily killed. Easily being the key word though. There was more than a good chance that he just fought to the very end. Which would be very cipher.
Find.
Fujin stated simply in her way.
Oh what?
Raijin turned to her and smiled.
We're gonna meet up with Cipher.
She made no motion to indicate yes, but it seemed that single word was enough. Raijin turned back to Squall and smiled.
Well, see ya, Squall. We're gonna head off to Galbadia to look for Cipher.
And just like that, the two of them ran off. Raijin smiling, Fujin herself. Squall watched them go and wondered if they were right or deluded. In a way, he found their unwavering loyalty rather nice. Cipher was lucky to have two such people as them. Well, he had been lucky. Squall moved towards the entrance at a much slower pace. As he moved, he spotted the bright blue of Rinoa's duster running towards the entrance. She was coming with them. He still needed to find a way to get her back to Balam. He would have to ask the headmaster here to see to it before he left. If he was going on another assignment, she needed to be safe. Quistis was already waiting at the front gates when he arrived. She looked up at him as he approached and her face set into an expression of relief.
There you are. We were looking for you. Why?
The short question didn't really invite an answer. Quistis just smiled instead.
Come on. He's meeting us further down the street. Let's go.
Zell was sprinting their way as Squall and Quistis reached the front. He was sweating and breathing hard, but he had made it through his punishment fast enough. Which Squall expected. He was a hand-to-hand fighter and therefore needed to be strong. Rinoa was leaning back against a tall, stone plant box on the side of the road. Squall diverted away from Quistis to move towards her. She smiled as he approached.
Hey,
she smiled, leaning back. She looked rather good for a girl who just found out her old crush had been executed. Squall was beginning to think that maybe she felt less for him than Cipher had felt for her. He had, after all, attacked a president for her. She had just found out about his death for said attack and now she was looking at him with bright eyes.
You okay now?
She asked, referring to his outburst. Squall nodded.
Want to talk about it? I'd rather not. Okay then,
she smiled, accepting the answer. He was rather surprised. Most people would insist on pressing him for details. They just couldn't leave well enough alone.
Oh. Hey, I think that's him.
He followed her gaze and saw a vehicle driving their way from the garden entrance. Because the headmaster couldn't just walk out here like a normal person. Squall was about to open his mouth to tell her that he would arrange transportation for her, in the private seed cabin, back to Balam for her own safety. She didn't give him a chance.
Just pretend I'm a seed, too,
she smiled at him, standing up straight.
It'll be less complicated that way.
And just like that, there went that plan. That was an order. She had just forbidden him from revealing her identity and it didn't matter what that envelope held. Her orders were high priority for him. He couldn't ask for transportation for her now. He made no show of his annoyance at her insistence on coming. He merely walked back to where the others had all fallen in line. Zell, Selfie, Quistis, Squall, and on his right, Rinoa. She smiled at him as the car parked and a man in a long blue suit stepped out. He looked like the headmaster for a military academy. Regal, tall, tough. He had no softness anywhere on his body. Almost the polar opposite of Headmaster Sid. Immediately, Squall liked him less. He certainly didn't have the same kind, fatherly smile. As he stepped closer, the seeds moved. Their legs locked together and they stood straight. Rinoa noticed their movements almost too late and she hurried to copy their pose. Their hands came up, the backs of their hands facing the headmaster. Rinoa mimicked them. Had her palm facing him. Then hastened to turn it.
"Good day,"
he nodded as they lowered their hands again. If he noticed Rinoa's inexperience in a simple salute, he gave no indication of it.
"I have official orders from Headmaster Sid addressed to you. Following regulations, I have gone over these orders myself. After careful consideration of our options, we have decided to fully assist and cooperate with Headmaster Sid."
As he spoke, he was pacing about in front of them. Not really looking at them. Treating them like machines ready to receive orders. Treating them, Rinoa realized, how they were used to being treated. The friendly, open way she had greeted them seemed silly now in contrast to this stark, distant approach. She was going to stick by hers as the right one.
"Actually,"
the headmaster continued, stopping to stare out at the skyline.
"We too have been planning something like this for quite some time now. In order to stress the importance of this mission, I must first brief you on the current situation."
Finally, he looked up and seemed to realize that they were all standing at attention.
At ease.
Everyone relaxed including Rinoa, glad now that was over. She was pretty sure she had locked her knees together. She thought she might pass out if he kept talking.
"You all know about the sorceress being appointed as the peace ambassador for the Galbadian government,"
the headmaster continued his pacing.
"However, this ambassador thing is just a cover-up. There will be no peace talks, only threats. The president has set a sorceress as his ambassador for just that reason. Sorceresses create fear among people. Therefore, peace talks are impossible. Galbadia is planning to use fear to negotiate favorable conditions for itself. It is clear that Galbadia's ultimate goal is domination over the other nations in the world. Perhaps to even set itself up as a superpower so that it can be a threat to SDR. Our garden, and yours, is no exception, either. It is a fact that the sorceress is planning to use this garden as her base of operations. Galbadia Garden, while part of Galbadia, has always considered itself rather separate from the government. However, with a sorceress holding her power over our heads, that is not an option. We have very few options available to us."
He stopped and turned to face them all again. Despite that, he still seemed to be looking at a spot over their heads. Rinoa thought he was rather rude. The others weren't bothered. As he continued speaking, he sounded robotic. Like he was reading from a pre-devised speech.
"We entrust world peace, and the future, to you. Details of the mission are enclosed in these official orders. Remember to burn them once you've read their contents. You are the leader."
Squall looked to Quistis. She had seniority over him. She made no move to claim leadership. Which left him little choice.
"Yes, sir."
He didn't offer his name, the headmaster didn't ask. Rinoa didn't like this coldness. Though it did sort of explain Squall's attitude.
"Then here. Make sure the ashes are spread out for good measure. You can never be sure when a sorceress is involved."
Squall nodded and took them. He opened the envelope and gave the contents a cursory glance. The others remained silent at his side as he looked them over.
"Any questions?"
the headmaster asked, standing back.
These orders say by means of a sniper.
Squall looked up.
We have no one with that skill.
That was odd. Headmaster Sid would know they had no sniper. Why would he give them orders that demanded for a skill they did not possess?
Don't worry about it,
the headmaster shook his head.
Let me introduce you to an elite sharpshooter from Galbadia Garden I will be loaning you. Kineas.
They all looked off to the side, following the headmaster's gaze. Kicked back on the grass, a young man wearing a long tan trench coat was lounging back with one hand under his head and one leg crossed over the other. He was so still he could have been a statue. He had one finger pointed up to the sky, unmoving as a butterfly dancing around. As they watched, the tiny, fearful creature landed on the tip of his finger. Looking up at it, the young man grinned in triumph. Then, mimicking the kickback of a gunshot, he blasted the butterfly. It flew away as the headmaster called for him again, aggravated.
Irvine Kineas.
Like it was his own decision, Irvine Kineas rolled over and came up on his feet in a smooth, coordinated single move. The dark gray barrel of a shotgun hit his shoulder as his long, auburn hair hit against his back. He reached up, adjusting the black cowboy hat on his head before turning to face them and grinning. His boots shuffled against the concrete ground as he walked their way. He stowed away his shotgun on his back, under his trench coat where it couldn't be seen, as he came in closer. His hands went to his pockets as he moved down the line, glancing at them all.
This is Irvine Kineas,
the headmaster said, indicating to him with irritation.
He will be your sharpshooter. You may leave whenever you are ready. Failure is not an option. I expect only perfection from you all.
With that rather cold dismissal, the headmaster turned and began heading back to his car. Irvine turned and took aim with the same gun that had blasted the butterfly.
Bang!
He said, grinning.
What a stiff!
The others ignored Irvine as they descended on Squall and the papers in his hand.
What kind of orders did we get?
Rinoa asked, bringing up that wee thing again. Squall supposed he could have fought it. Really, what would be the point? Besides, she hadn't said he was allowed to disclose her identity to Irvine. He was still under orders.
Our next mission,
Squall said, turning over the paper and frowning.
This is no ordinary mission. It's a direct order from both VIII and Galbadia Garden.
That in itself was unusual. But it was the nature of the orders that really made it special.
We're to assassinate the sorceress.
Rinoa took a surprised step back as the others gaped at him.
You can't be serious,
she said.
That's so awesome.
Zell laughed.
I can't believe we're getting such a high-profile mission so early.
Selfie squealed.
I'm sure Headmaster Sid put the right people on the job.
Quistis nodded, smiling gently. Rinoa shook her head. How was she always surprised at the way they reacted? She had to remember that she was raised very differently from these people. Their normal and hers were on opposite ends of the spectrum.
We're to shoot her from afar,
Squall continued over their excitement.
Kineas will be our sharpshooter. We're to support Kineas to get him in place and, should he fail, we are to attack head-on. Thanks for that support,
Irvine grinned, cocky.
But I never miss my target.
Squall would rather hope so.
Basically, eliminate the sorceress. That's our order. We're to head to the capital of Galbadia, Deling City. There, we'll meet up with General Caraway to go over details of the plan.
Squall's eyes moved to Rinoa as her body suddenly stiffened. He looked up, but she was deliberately looking away from them. Definitely not inviting questions. Well, if she was going to give him the courtesy of not pressing for information, then he would return the same kindness. It was not his business.
We should get going,
he said, folding the orders.
Zell, burn these. Yup.
Zell took the orders in hand.
Ifrit, light 'em up.
Rinoa smiled as Irvine started as a fireball appeared in Zell's hands. The papers, the evidence, was raised to ash very quickly.
Arrow,
Quistis threw out her own spell. The smoke and ash was blown away. Zell shook his hand, putting out the fire. Then, grinning, he blew on his fingers.
I don't think we should move as a big group like this,
Squall said, looking between the six of them. It was bad enough that he was suspicious on sight. No need to make it worse by traveling in such a large party.
We'll split up here and meet up again in Delling City before seeking out General Caraway. Well then,
Irvine grinned, stepping forward.
We'll need to choose traveling parties for the trip. If I might make a suggestion.
Squall raised his eyebrow as Irving stepped closer. Not to him, but to Selfie. He took her shoulder and steered her over to Rinoa. Standing between them, he grinned over at where Squall was left with Quistis and Zell.
How's this?
He asked as Rinoa and Selfie exchanged a glance under his head. He had deliberately picked the two youngest girls to be on his party. Rinoa was the most attractive of the three girls. Followed, Squall had assumed, by Quistis. The former instructor who was giving Irvine a cold look, however, had not been picked. She looked more irritated that he had picked by attractiveness than the fact that she had been passed up. It was also not a good match-up of powers. Irvine and Rinoa were their most precious cargo. Rinoa because she wasn't seed and, in fact, an employer. And Irvine because of his skill that made him invaluable to the mission. Then again, Selfie was no pushover. Her speed and fast eye could get the three of them to Delling City without issue. Especially if Squall, Zell, and Quistis, the best fighters, went first to clear the way. Selfie would act as protection for the most valuable cargo, and they would be the vanguard. Looking at it that way, he was rather satisfied.
All right then,
he nodded, surprising everyone.
Have a good time.
Selfie made a face, putting her hands to her hips.
Are you being sarcastic? You are, aren't you? Well, fine then. We will have a good time.
Rinoa was nodding along with her, her nose in the air.
We understand perfectly, Squall.
Then, her sweetest smile in place, she reached out and took Irvine's arm.
Come on, Mr. Kineas. Let's be on our way.
Hey. Wait. What was she doing? Why was she holding on to him like that?
Call me Irvine,
Kineas replied, covering her hand with his, only serving to annoy Squall further, as he gave her a sweet smile in return.
I'm a pretty lucky guy. Hand in hand with two beautiful girls.
Selfie wasn't used to being called beautiful. Spastic, tiny, psychotic, these were things she was used to. The compliment was far more effective on her than Rinoa. She looked like she melted as she took hold of Irvine's other arm, earning a smile and a wink from him.
Irvi Kinapu,
she purred at him.
I'll make sure we have a real good time.
And what the heck was with that? Squall frowned to himself as Irvine walked away arm in arm with both girls. What had he said that was so terrible? Women. He didn't understand women.
I think I feel sick,
Quistis said, making a face at his back.
Irvine Kinias,
Zell growled at him.
Loser.
Quistis grinned before reaching out and taking Squall's arm in a manner not dissimilar to the way Selfie had grabbed Irvine.
Come on, Squall. Let's go.
Hey. What was she doing? Why was she holding on to him like that?
Squall, let's get going.
Zell jerked his thumb forward to where the others were.
We have to get there before they do.
Oh, grow up. Squall didn't have a chance to get to tell him. Zell and Quistis were already running forward. Quistis was dragging Squall as she did so. Since it was his plan to get ahead of them and act as vanguard anyway, he allowed her to do so. As they passed the slower team, Rinoa blinked and stared at the way Quistis was holding on to Squall, a large smile on her face. Hey. Wait. What was he doing? Why was he letting her hold on to him like that? End of chapter.